Hi, everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started, given it's about 1 minute too. So my name is Kelly Ireland. I'm one of the directors at TransPerfect Learning Solutions. I'm lucky enough to get to work on the content side of things, and I'm super excited to talk to you today on some of the immediate tips and tricks you can implement to your content to make it more accessible for everyone. So today I'm going to cover some of the bases of what do we mean when we say accessibility, why is it important, and who exactly are we catering for when we talk about accessibility. So in 2017, the e-commerce business in the UK was valued at 450 billion. In 2023, that's set to more than double to 970 billion. 4 million people in the UK have left e-commerce sites when they did not meet accessibility criteria. And those 4 million people make up 15 billion in revenue. And why is this important? So if someone who has accessibility issues is leaving a site that they've willingly visited to try and purchase something they want, they're definitely not going to engage with training content that they're being forced to take by an employer on something like IT or compliance. So it's extremely important that everything we're creating is being done so with accessibility in mind. And who are we doing this for? So does anyone have any idea what this number represents? So it's 1 billion. Exactly. So there is it's estimated that there are 1 billion people worldwide who have some form of disability. That represents 15% of the world's population, and that means 1 in 7 of your learners have some form of disability that affects how they engage and learn their content. So what do we mean by disability? So a lot of people, when they hear disability, will think of a physical disability or a motor disability, but it can affect a lot of different areas, like you see here, visual, auditive, and cognitive, and psychological. So everything from dyslexia to visual impairments, color blindness, falls into all of these categories of disability. And if you're rejecting any of these or not thinking about them when you are creating your content, you can be missing out on a huge variety of people that you want to interact with. So how do we measure accessibility? So the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, have outlined 3 categories that you can be measured against. The first one is A, essential. So this is the absolute minimum requirements you can meet. And if you're at this level, it means that most people with a form of disability probably cannot engage or access your content. AA is acceptable. This is where most web content and digital learning will fall. It means you're meeting some of the guidelines, you're doing a pretty good job, and most people can probably get by with your content. AAA is optimal. This is what everyone should pretty much be aiming for if they're producing any content online. This means that everyone with a disability or not should be able to equally engage and interact with your content and take away the same learning experience. So how do we measure what fits into those different criterias? So there are actually 78 different accessibility criterias, and they fall into the POUR system. So perceivable, so everyone must be able to perceive your content in a similar way, no matter how they're receiving that information. Operable, ensuring that no matter how they can operate, they can still engage. Understandable, speaking your audience's language, and this isn't just with regards to translation. And then robust, so it can function on both old and new technologies. It can have things like screen readers. It can reach the entire demographic. So now that we know what accessibility is and who we're doing it for, how do we create that accessible content? And what are some of the immediate and small changes you can make to your content to make it more accessible for that 1 in 7 learners you're trying to reach? So I'm going to cover a couple of different categories in these that are super quick wins that you can either take back home tomorrow and implement within your organizations or bear in mind for any future content that is being created. The first reflects on color contrast and coloring. So anyone who is visually impaired can have trouble recognizing different color contrasts on a screen. So it's been super hip and trendy over the last few years to use either your really chic brand colors or to go super glitzy and not really thinking about the impact that color has on any of your users or on their ability to read it. So the actual criteria to fit in if you're using coloring on a page for images is a 3-to-1 ratio difference, and for font, 4.5-to-1. Anything less than that, then you are failing your accessibility criteria for anyone with a disability or a visual impairment. There's a lot of different tools online. They're free that you can really quickly check if you fit into this ratio. One of them is called Snook, SNOOK.ca, and you can immediately put in the colors you're using, and it will tell you if you fit inside that ratio. So a quick example of this. How many people can super easily read this? So just a show of hands. Okay, front row's cheating. So how many people have to squint a little bit to see this or actually really struggle with reading this at all? Okay. Then if we make one slight change of just that color contrast and ratio, how much easier is that? So people sitting at the back, it's an immediate difference. The text is exactly the same. The font is exactly the same. The size is exactly the same. But all we did was flip that color contrast so it's easier to see. The next one is around images. So we've seen a massive trend in the last few years. People really want to move away from super text-heavy content. And people are finding, imagery perfect. We can relay what we want to say with images. We don't have to write a ton of text. It makes it more fun. It makes it more engaging. But if you're working with someone who might have a disability with interpreting an image or working with an image, they could be missing out not only on the experience, but also on the information you're providing. So how do we get around this without having tons and tons of text? So if you're working with imagery, what you need to bear in mind is alt text. So it's alternative text that is built into your HTML code. And what that does is provide descriptors of the image that you're using. Now, you can see here there's examples of okay, better, and best alt text. And the key differentiators of these is how descriptive you're being. So if we just say rooster, if everyone closed their eyes and I said the word rooster, I guarantee you every single person in this audience would picture something different. If I say rooster crowing, yes, it narrows it down, but still it's open to a lot of different interpretation. Whereas if I get very specific, describe exactly what's on screen, red-crested rooster crowing. You've got the type of rooster, you've got the coloring, and you've got what it's doing. So it doesn't leave too much room for interpretation, so it ensures your learner is getting exactly what you are trying to convey. And this also ties back to those categories we touched on. So the OK alt text will kind of put you in the essential category. Then you'll fall into the other kind of AA and AAA categories. And that's how you can keep pushing to get yourself into that top accessibility category by looking at ways you can be as inclusive as possible. The next is text. So I did cheat and Google the hardest to read fonts out there, and this is what came up. So again, similar to imagery and color, it's become very kind of, trendy over the last few years to do very on-brand font and training. But what might work for your logo or your 3-word tagline is not the kind of font that should be used throughout all of your content. Not only because it could be hard to read, but if it's not easy to read, again, anyone with a learning difficulty, dyslexia, visual impairments will not be able to follow on with your text. So font choice is massively important, but also font size. is your user able to zoom in? Does your font still work on multiple different technologies so that they can zoom in and zoom out as they need to see different elements? And is it easy to read? So these are some examples of the worst. And you can see here where when it says nervous, things like this can be extremely hard for also visually impaired people to pick up and read if it's in motion, like the calligraphy style, or if it has any sort of animation to it. Instead, you should aim for something like sans serif, Tahoma, or Helvetica. And what these all have in common, they're plain, they're straight, so immediately your eyes can better interpret it and follow it along. It doesn't cause any kind of squinting, so it doesn't lead to any kind of, learner burnout or fatigue as they're reading through. And it all equally zooms in and out super well without losing any of that impact. So it's user-friendly. The next is interactions. So there's a couple of different ones on this. The first one is anyone who here works with something like Articulate Rise will know that the drag and drop assessment is everyone's favorite. It's super easy to do, super easy to create. A lot of different people use it. The issue with something like doing a drag and drop assessment or functionality is that anyone who needs to do a mouseless experience, so if they're physically disabled and cannot use a mouse, cannot actually take part in that activity. So what you're doing is immediately excluding that group by not providing something like a text-based alternative that they can work into. So there's a couple of different suggestions through Rise and Articulate of different alternatives you can provide if you are using something that isn't keyboard friendly, that it's absolutely mouse specific. Another one with interactions is using buttons like click here. Okay, great. Why am I clicking there? What does that mean? So if I'm someone who is visually impaired or has a learning difficulty, and I'm using something like a screen reader to go through your content, and it just says click here, I don't know what that means. I don't know where it's going to bring me. It's not descriptive. So instead of just saying click here, you can use verbiage like click here to see our T's and C's on this. Click here to proceed to the next page. It's giving much more description and guidance to the user as they work through. And then the other one is flashing imagery. So anyone that suffers from something like epilepsy or anything, containing anything with flashing videos, imagery, can immediately be hazardous to them. So you should work to keep things on the plainer side if possible. And then again, if it's imagery within that color contrast. So a quick example of someone who is scoring a AAA right now is Salesforce. So they have actually worked extremely hard to reach the AAA status across almost all of their products. How they've done this is a couple of examples you can see on screen. So they have very easy to follow layout. So you can see very clear navigation around the page. They have things like the buttons don't just say click here. They say start my free trial, watch demos, try for free, let's chat. So it's very, very descriptive. All of their products work on multiple different technologies, so their screen can zoom in and out. It has about 150% zoom rate. So this is actually one of the most accessible content companies out there right now. So it's a great model to base it off. The big one. So video and audio, again, similar. Since, I don't know about you, but since the pandemic, I've seen the biggest uprise in companies wanting to do video content. And video is great. Video is super engaging. It's super helpful. It's super useful. But if you're not creating video with accessibility in mind, it means anyone, again, who's visually impaired, deaf, can really struggle to interact and understand that video. And there's a couple of quick ways that you can really make a huge difference. So some of the more obvious ones, adding subtitles. Even, I don't know about you guys, but when I'm on the tube and I want to watch something and I have my headphones and the video is not subtitled, I'm instantly annoyed and inconvenienced. So if I'm someone with an actual hearing impairment and I can't interact with that video because there's not subtitles, that's going to have a huge impact on my experience. So Along with adding subtitles, you can do things like audio narration. So don't just subtitle the text, describe what's going on. You know, what are we seeing on screen? Give that descriptor so that they're not missing out on anything while watching the video. Another thing is providing a transcript. So again, if any of your users are using a tool like a screen reader, their screen reader can directly pick up that transcript so that they can get that full experience and have that description as they watch the video. So this is pretty much, there's been a massive demand for this to the point where Peloton, last August, they actually moved to subtitling their live videos because anyone in the disability community that wanted to partake in this that required subtitles used to have to wait 48 hours for a class to be published to their library for subtitles to be added. So they could not take a live class. So after some kind of push in the community, Peloton only last August brought out this feature of live subtitling. I've also heard it's not yet perfect, like a lot of live subtitling, but it is getting there. So when you see companies like this even pushing for this inclusivity and this accessibility, it can just really make you think of the little things we can be doing in the day and day just to be more inclusive. So to quickly recap, the 5 buckets that you can kind of make the most immediate impact and really push yourself to get to that optimal AAA is focusing on your color contrast. So that 3:1 ratio for any imagery, 4.5:1 ratio for any text. If you're using images, ensure you're using your alt text and being as descriptive as possible. When selecting text, ensure it has a good readability, so the font you're choosing, that it can be read across multiple screens, and that it has zoomability. Your interactions, that if you are providing that's something that is mouse-driven, that you are providing a text-based alternative, that you're being descriptive with your call to actions, and that you're not using anything that's flash photography. And then with your video and audio, subtitling where possible, voiceover where possible, and then providing that transcript to the videos as well. So if you're implementing all of these, you can ensure you're striving to get to that optimal place, and that your 1 in 7 users that does have a form of disability can just as equally interact with your content as someone that's full-bodied. So thank you very much. And I think we have time for some questions if anyone has anything. Anyone have any questions, or? I'm not going to hear you.
Hi, thank you for that. So, notwithstanding our sort of moral obligation to implement accessibility features, could you elaborate on the current sort of legal framework and what we are supposed to be doing legally can be held accountable for if we don't, sort of now in the future to come? I know these things are changing all the time. What's the status now?
So you're 100% right. This is changing constantly. So the WCAG, those guidelines that I outlined, have put together a framework. It's not a legal framework, but each country actually has its own accessibility legal guidelines. So I would be very conscious to check each of the markets you're operating in and what their legal guidelines are. So in the UK, I think there's the 2016 Disabilities Act, which ensures that, you know, anyone with a disability should be receiving a fair experience. It is constantly moving, so I'd be very conscious to check each of the markets you're in. But I think anything under that essential can be claimed then as discriminatory. So if someone cannot get the same interaction or experience on something like a compliance training, if they can't equally understand that compliance training and you run into a compliance issue, then it can be looked at as discriminatory, or the trainer can be looked at fault for that.
Does that mean that if a website or organisation is being looked at multinationally, then the content needs to adhere to the accessibility regulations in all of the countries it's being accessed in?
Yes, exactly. So you should be reviewing any of the markets that either if you have a website that your users are engaging from, or if you're doing digital learning that any of your learners sit in, because it does vary so much per country. Places like the UK are much stricter on it, as well as Europe, and other countries are coming along. Just not even from an equality perspective, but what I mentioned earlier, that the 4 million users in the UK that had to abandon an e-commerce website represented 15 billion of spend. And if you are working in e-commerce or doing anything online where you have to engage, you're missing out on just a huge, huge audience.
Thank you very much. You mentioned about interaction, how drag and drop's a real struggle. Do you have any alternatives or different ways of doing that to try and maintain that? Because I hate to say it, but it is a really quite a nice thing to have in a course. So is there alternatives or better ways of doing it?
So the immediate one is just a text-based alternative where you have a typing functionality that's not just mouse-based, so it doesn't rely on someone's physical abilities to drag and drop. Depending on the authoring tool you're using, especially the Articulate suite, have really helpful specific blogs on their pages, whether it's Storyline or Rise, on accessibility and the exact functionality you can do to help improve accessibility. So it's really authoring tool specific, what's available, but I would definitely check out whichever one you're using because they go into quite granular detail on what can be done instead of each functionality.
So my question was around subtitles. Do you think that does it make a difference whether they are set as a default or just having them as an optional?
So that again is pretty optional. So what you're looking at is either the burnt in, so where you can turn them off, or just uploading something like an SRT file. So it's like a Netflix. You can turn it on and off or select your language or have it. So I really think it depends on the use case. I think if it's company-wide content, having something like an SRT file that you can just turn it on and off is always helpful. Unless you're doing something like an audio description that you wanted built in around the video. But I think SRT and that option works super well for a lot of things, especially even if you're working in the UK and most of your company, 90% can speak English, but you've got people from Spain and France, even if they can work in English, still that learning ability to just be able to turn on subtitles just while they're listening to receive it in their native language can just be a huge help in what they're able then to take away from that learning.
Thank you. I'm a learning designer, and we use our own alt texts, alternative texts, so they're not built in the HTML. And we have a question in my company. There's like different opinions about, do we include decorative images, so the images that are there for decoration purposes? The guidelines say no, but then there are those that believe that there should be something there for people to appreciate the whole kind of like artistic or anything else that's on the page anyway, that's more creative. What's your thought on this?
So I actually am a fan of decorational images. I think they can work really well for learner engagement. I think where you fall into a slight gray area is where you start relying on images to present information or to be actually built into the learning design, so that if someone can see that image, how much does it affect them? So if you block out that image or you can't see it, does it affect the information you're absorbing from that page? Is it purely decorative, or does it contain information that's pertinent to what you're learning? Does it go to your experience? So examples that come to mind when you're doing scenario-based learning, a lot of people will say, put a character there, and they'll put speech bubbles, and they'll ask you questions. So something like that, if I am visually impaired and I'm not getting that, that's going to affect my experience. But if there's a pretty flower in the corner, it's not really going to affect, but it's still, you can include that alt text if you want to paint the full picture. But it's more when text or information is contained within the image is where the really kind of hard line comes in. Any other questions? Any other questions? Yeah.
Storyline. I know that you can hide stuff from any screen readers, so it's a good way to kind of like still have it there but not interrupt. So if you're exporting from like Illustrator or something, you usually get asset to flow or whatever. So you can, if you go into the accessibility, right clicking on the image, you can then hide it, and it'll kind of get around that having it but not being disruptive. No, I guess, yeah. But it's, yeah, I'd keep it, but hide it, yeah.
Cool. I think we're out of time, but thank you so much. I am at a booth over in the corner, number 46. If anyone has any questions, or please feel free to connect on LinkedIn. It's always a topic I'm really happy to discuss. Thank you.